Today I want to talk about the writer-rider split. And I don't want to talk about people who write versus people who ride. What I'm interested in is the vowel and consonant sounds that live in these two words and what we can learn about dialects of English from the split between the way these two words are pronounced. So I want to start out with a disclaimer about written language, because the way that these words are spelled really has nothing to do with the way that they're pronounced. Spelling is a foe in the realm of dialectology and phonetics and phonology in general. Really, spelling only matters in the very narrow discipline of writing systems in linguistics, and everywhere else in linguistics, it's kind of just a pain in the butt. So that's why we use the International Phonetic Alphabet, because that gives us a much higher fidelity transcription of the way speech sounds. Remember, language has been around for tens of thousands of years. Writing has only been around for a couple thousand years. Language precedes writing, and it goes on changing even once a writing system has been codified. So writing really has nothing to do with language change. And you can know that kind of intuitively because there are hundreds of dialects of English. There are many, many hundreds of ways that a single word can be pronounced, but there's usually one or maybe two spellings for a given word. So steer clear of spelling when you're thinking through these problems. Before I start to attack the rather complicated case of writer versus rider, I want to use a simpler example to establish something you might not know about general American dialects, which is what I'll call the bitter merger. So these words bitter and bitter, again, don't be fooled by the spelling. They're actually pronounced identically. This is how you would transcribe them in IPA. It's bitter and bitter. They are one and the same. If you are a speaker of an American dialect, I urge you to pronounce these words. You will find, no matter how much you might be tricked by the spelling, they're both pronounced as bitter. And this is true of all medial t and d sounds. Anytime you have a t or a d between two vowels in American English, they are actualized as this phoneme here, which is called a flap. So this is actually an allophone, for those of you who have taken the phonetics and phonology course, of the t and d phonemes. If you ask an American speaker to pronounce this letter, they might have trouble with it, but in reality, we say this all the time. It's the same as ladder versus ladder. In American English, these are pronounced identically. It's actually the same, if for any Spanish speakers out there, as the r sound in the word para or corazón. This r sound is the same as the r in ladder and ladder, and bitter and bitter. This is all the same sound. The spelling is a little confusing. You'd think, how could a T and an R produce the same allophone? But actually, in reality, that is what you're getting. And I urge you, if you're confused by this, to really try it out. Say it a million times and feel what your tongue is doing as it taps the part of the roof of your mouth right behind your teeth. It's called a flap. So that's what I mean when I use this term flap. This is very characteristic of the vast majority of American dialects, and even it shows up in Australian dialects as well. But you can pretty much see it across the board that bitter and bitter are pronounced identically.
Bitter, bitter.
Whether you're from the Midwest,
bitter, bitter,
or Brooklyn,
bitter, bitter.
I like this example because my grandma realizes that she is pronouncing bitter and bitter identically, and it makes her laugh a little bit because it's probably the first time that she's thought about that. Now, it will behoove you to learn that in British speech, this merger does not exist. Bitter and bidda are maintained as two different sounds. They are pronounced differently in something like received pronunciation. Received pronunciation is the standard dialect of England. It's sometimes abbreviated as RP. And Peter Trudgill, the British linguist, estimates that about 3% of Britons speak received pronunciation. A great deal more Britons speak what's called near RP, or a dialect very similar to received pronunciation, and this number is probably growing. So you might know RP as like the way John Oliver speaks English when he says things like, "It's not easy being British, as Kermit so nearly said." So here is how bitter, bidder split sounds in near RP, a dialect similar to received pronunciation.
Bitter, bidder, bitter, bidder.
If you write that out phonetically, you'd find it is something like this. Bitter and bidder. So the t and the d are maintained in British speech in a way that they aren't in American speech. This consonant split will be really important to keep in mind when we're thinking about the writer-rider split. So let us for a moment leave the realm of bitter and tackle the bigger problem, which is the writer-rider split. And we can start off by just looking at how this would be pronounced in a couple of different dialects. So here is writer-rider in received pronunciation.
Writer, rider, writer, rider.
Writer, rider, writer, rider.
And you'll notice in RP, you get the nice t in writer, writer, and you get the nice d in rider, rider. And you can see that represented by the t and d in the IPA transcription. But what you might not expect, or what you might not have heard of before, is that the vowel actually changes in the writer, rider discrepancy. In the word writer, the diphthong is I. In the word rider, the diphthong is I. So played out, rider sounds more like I, as in the sight organ, and writer sounds more like the I in the Yiddish expression oy vey. This is a little hard to hear. We're actually, our minds are wired not to hear the difference between these two diphthongs. These are allophones of each other. They only change according to context, but they're not phonemes in the language that we're programmed to recognize. So it can be a little counterintuitive to hear the difference between these two pronunciations as isolated incidents. But in American English, we have an advantage. So this was RP. But in American English, we have an advantage in trying to hear the difference between these two vowel sounds. Because in General American, there is no consonant difference between these two sounds, between the two ways these words are pronounced. So in the case of the person who writes, we could write that like this. There's that flap again. And in the case of the person who rides, there's the flap again. We get a transcription like that. So we can all hear the difference between a writer and a rider, but in spite of the spelling, what changes between those two words is not the consonant. The consonant stays the same. It's a flap in both cases. The difference between these two words is this diphthong, this vowel sound in the first syllable, the I and the I vowel sound. So you can say that to yourself, writer, rider, writer, rider. What's changing is the vowel. This I sound that exists in the word writer is actually a process called Canadian raising. Canadian raising. The vowel gets a little bit higher in the mouth. So as you go higher up in Canada, things start to rise a little. If you're on your way to Toronto, in Canada, your vowels start to rise, and that's how you get words like about.
About. About. About. About.
If you hear a Canadian accent, you might recognize it as Canadian because of this characteristic rising that you get in the vowels. So Canadians do this more often than the North American speakers south of the border. So this also happens in some northern states in the Midwest. So you have people in Michigan sometimes say higher instead of higher. One way you can hear this for yourself is by listening to the difference between the way you pronounce the word high and the way you pronounce the word high school. High school. In the word high school, there is Canadian rising, even in general American dialects. So here are a few of the samples I recorded of speakers saying high with this diphthong here, and then saying high school with the Canadian raised diphthong.
High school, high school, high school, high school, high.
Okay, so maybe by now, if you're lucky, you can hear the difference between the I diphthong of writer and the I diphthong of rider, but that doesn't really explain why that's the case. Like, why should these two words have this different vowel sound in the middle? So maybe if I give you a list of cases in which this pops up, like many things in phonetics and phonology, it follows a really rigid rule. And we look at the rule and we can kind of like deduce why something is the way it is based on the cases in which it pops up. So this same distinction exists in words like sighted versus sided, as in not blind but sighted, and two-sided, light and lied, bite and bide, plight and plied. Remember, ignore the spelling here. Spelling has nothing to do with it. Just think of the pronunciation. And height and hide. So this is a series of minimal pairs. These are words that differ by only a single phoneme. And in each case, one of the words has the I diphthong and the other has the I diphthong. So maybe take a second to try to think about why it would be that these pairs of words vary. Actually, it turns out that the I diphthong always occurs when followed by the T phoneme, and the I diphthong always occurs when followed by the D phoneme. And keep in mind, I'm writing here letters that exist in English, but I'm writing the International Phonetic Alphabet transcription. It just so happens in this case that they're the same as the English alphabet, but that doesn't have to be the case. So we found the rule here. When a syllable is followed by the T sound, it becomes I. When it's followed by the D sound, it becomes I. And actually, there's a more general rule at play here, and you can find it by looking at other similar examples. So I'll give you the example of rice versus rise, and lice versus lies, and strife versus strive, and tripe versus tribe. In each case, the first word has the I diphthong and the second word has the I diphthong. And you can figure out that the reason for this is that these are all unvoiced consonants at the end of the syllable, and these are all voiced consonants at the end of the syllable. If you don't know what voicing is, it basically means whether your vocal cords are vibrating. So if your vocal cords vibrate on the final consonant in the syllable, it takes the I diphthong. If your vocal cords do not vibrate in the final consonant of the syllable, it takes the I diphthong. This sounds incredibly complicated, and it is. Our brains are doing so much processing behind the scenes. It's kind of an exploration into our subconscious. We know all of these very complicated linguistic rules without ever having to think about them, and that's pretty cool in my opinion. So I'll leave you with one final thought about the writer-rider distinction, which is this. In the case of the word writer, which we can write like this in IPA, and in the case of the word rider, we no longer have the t-d distinction that British speech does. In American English, both of these words have a flap in the middle. And yet, even though we lost that consonant difference, the vowel sound split remains. So the word writer, the vowels in the word writer act as though there is still a T at the end of that syllable. The vowels in the word rider still act as though there is a D in the word rider. In reality, both of them have this kind of lame flap sound, but the vowels don't realize that. The vowels are still going on doing their business as though these consonants are still in place. So the vowels follow the rule even though the consonants no longer do. Well, there's a process in linguistics called Cheshirization. You know the Cheshire cat whose grin hangs around even after the cat itself has disappeared? Well, that's exactly what is going on here. Even though the consonant sounds have disappeared, this vowel sound sticks around. And that is called, I kid you not, Cheshirization. Or to use the British spelling, Cheshirization. Although, as I recommended, never pay attention to spelling, it always will mislead you.